In this episode,
I do expect people to be rocking a blanket.
I'm baffled, to be honest, why manufacturers provide thermostats in the UK that go up to 30 degrees heating.
We have a wood burner and that's what we put on when Granny comes round.
Because it'll just blow their mind, you know what I mean?
It's been said before, there's never been a passionate boiler installer.
In practical terms, we cheat in our house.
But 200's okay, but don't spend more than 10 minutes in the shower.
And I don't know if this is going to resonate with your audience at all.
welcome to another episode of Homeowners Q&A. I'm your host Mars, and today we're talking about how to educate your family about heat pump benefits and how to make the adjustment to this new way of heating your home. Joining me for this conversation are three fantastic guests. We have Louise Howlett from R.A. Brown Heating Services, Chris Higgs, a seasoned heat pump expert, and Karl Richardson from Logikool. Welcome, everybody. But before we get started, we'd like to thank Logikool for sponsoring today's episode. Logikool is revolutionizing the way that we think about food waste with their innovative home composter. By turning your food scraps into real organic compost using tested microbes, Logikool offers a sustainable solution to waste disposal. Not only does this help reduce harmful methane emissions from landfills, but it also creates natural compost that can benefit your garden and the environment. With the ability to process up to 1 kilogram of food scraps per day and a power consumption of just 1.25 kilowatt hours, Logikool is the perfect companion for eco-conscious homeowners looking to reduce their carbon footprint. To find out more about Logikool, please visit their website, link in the description. So Chris, do you want to get the ball rolling for us today? Heat pumps differ quite vastly in the way that they operate to traditional boilers. So there is often a time where families have to make an adjustment, from switching from a boiler to a heat pump. Can you just walk us through how the heating experience differs from a heat pump to a boiler?
I suppose the first thing to say is it shouldn't. Obviously, if we're using a boiler correctly, then it should be no different to the way that we're using a heat pump in terms of that sort of low and slow and low temperature heating model. Traditionally in the UK, though, as you know, anyone that's watching this and the guys we've got on there on the podcast today will, I'm sure, recognise, the way that we do it within the UK is it is on and off heating. We walk in, it's cold, switch on the heating, ramp the temperature up. Half an hour later, it switches off again, and we just end up in that cycle. Not condensing if we've got a condensing boiler, which we should have, at least if it's a boiler, and just back into that same cycle again. With a heat pump, we don't have the same amount of kilowatts that we do with a traditional fossil fuel boiler, so we have to run it longer and at a lower temperature. Ideally at a lower temperature, because we don't have the same tolerances that we do with a fossil fuel boiler. Back to the original point I said, we should be running a gas boiler or a fossil fuel boiler the same way that we're doing a heat pump. Traditionally in the UK, we don't do that. But with a heat pump, we don't have, as I said before, we don't have that same level of kilowatts just to throw at a property, to walk in, it's cold, press on, and we heat up within an hour, and then the thing turns off again. So there's got to be a mindset change in terms of, basically set it and forget it. Yes, we might have some kind of setback temperature or room temperature in terms of, drop down from like 21 to 19 or 18, but ultimately we want to be running that thing for as long as we can, Dave. I always look at this, and perhaps this is where I come from, like an automotive engineering background many years ago. I always think of it with that sort of mechanical sympathy in mind. With a car, you sit on a motorway, you're running it at 50, 60, 70 miles an hour, and you're just running at 2,500 RPM. Beautiful. Engine loves it. If you're constantly stop starting, the longevity of the engine is just going to, there's going to be a quarter of the miles that you're going to get out of it. So it's about having that sort of understanding of the mechanical sympathy and the mechanical components.
So you mentioned running your boiler low and slow. I mean, when we moved into our property, we actually inherited an oil boiler, and it was anything but. It was cranked up to running at like 70 degrees. Why is it that installers are still doing that, Karl? I mean, when you guys had I assume that you had a boiler before you put a heat pump in. Were you guys running that boiler low and slow before you put the heat pump in?
I've actually not had a boiler for, almost 20 years. But even then, I think possibly because of my background in climate control air conditioning, I learned that having a setback at 16 degrees during the day and then having it coming back on, rising to 20 at say 3:30, 4 o'clock, that was the way, and it was more efficient. I don't know what that was based on, really, just smart thinking and listening to people. You know, part of the problem is, and you mentioned, you know, installers and engineers. They're part of the problem. We've got in the air conditioning sector, which is, as we know, is heat pumps, sometimes not the smartest when it comes to advising people on how to control these systems, because they install them and they walk away. I think there's a gap there. You should install it, and then you should talk to either the homeowner or the building owner if it's a commercial premises to say, look, this is how you should control it. But they don't. It just gets installed and walked away. And I think that's where the problem is. And I know that from first-hand experience with many installations, that they just all installed and there is no operator knowledge. Mine runs like a dream, like you, Chris, and we understand how it works and how it should work. It's trying to understand, I suppose the bigger question is, why don't other people understand how it works and how it should work? I'm baffled, to be honest, why manufacturers provide thermostats in the UK that go up to 30 degrees heating. That's part of the problem as well. You know, if you're allowed to put it to 30, people are going to put it to 30, aren't they? But I've had the battle as well. I had that battle many years ago and unfortunately won it, you know.
So, Louise, our forums this year have been busier than they've ever been. And the one recurring theme that we see from people that actually come to the forums with a problem is that there hasn't been a proper handover to them. So they've actually not physically been taught how to operate that heat pump properly. And as a result of that, as Chris said, you know, they'll go up to the thermostat, they'll try and crank the heat up, or they'll turn it off for a couple of hours during the day. As part of your services, is that quite an important thing that you need to do as an installer, to actually go to the customer and say, look, your heat pump is very different to the boiler. This is the way that you should be running it if you want to make it run as efficiently and cost effectively as possible. Is that something that you guys do?
Absolutely. As I go on in this industry, and I've been in this industry for over 20 years, I get more and more passionate about explaining to people about weather compensation and the difference to thermostatically controlled heating. And I'm not an engineer, but I've begun to realize the kind of my lived experience of my home for past over 15 years with a heat pump and weather compensation, and that even heat and the way it just tops itself up. It's sensor controlled, not thermostatically controlled, and the difference that makes, and that's one of the benefits. And I really hate it when people move into a house and, as you say, they don't have the handover. Or I really hate it if you discover that somebody's moved into a house and they've got a heat pump, but actually it's still being thermostatically controlled, because they're not getting the full benefit of that technology change that they've gone, you know, that journey they've gone on. You know, we really offer appointments after the installation. We set it up, people are handed over, and then we have a 6-week follow-up, which particularly sometimes that's not a 6-week follow-up, because if it's in the summertime and they've not had the heating switched on, they need to have an appointment when it's the heating season to just check the heat curves, check everything is set up the way they want it to get to their comfort level, and also to that education part about not turning it on and off and just keeping. I mean, our house, it just runs. I don't know. It's not quite 21. It's 20 point something degrees. You know, all the time. And Richard really advises people. You know, it's like these off-peak electricity tariffs, using those smartly and not having like a setback in the middle of the night per se, so that the fabric of your house is just as warm when you get up in the morning. All this old-fashioned thing of, oh, we put it on between 6:30 and 8:30 or something, and then again at 4:30 to 7:30. It's like that is so detrimental to the way the heat pump, the way low water temperature heating should run, isn't it? Once you understand it, and even as a homeowner, you never want to go back to that old-fashioned on-off system, do you?
So you guys do it, Louise. Why is it that other installers aren't doing that? Why is the level of handover and education to the homeowners just so poor? Surely, if there's something wrong with my system, all I'm going to do is I'm going to keep picking up the phone and phoning you and harassing you, saying, look, there's something wrong. Why aren't more installers doing that?
I don't know. I mean, we're an industry of mainly small independent installers, or then big kind of faceless utility installers. I can't really comment on what their after sale or their setup system is, but small independent installers, sometimes you go down to literally one-man band installers, and sometimes they're going to struggle with resources, aren't they? I personally think there's a sweet spot of a kind of, what I'm trying to build in my company, a sort of an SME where you have got all the different roles. And like we have a guy who does the 6-week follow-ups, who's also in the servicing team. So then they kind of meet the servicing engineer at the same time as that, checking the settings and checking to understand everything, because that works for the business model, doesn't it, of carrying on with the servicing and building that relationship, building and continuing that relationship. But I guess if you're a one-man band and you're literally going from one install to the next install, how do you build that in? It's not always possible, is it? So it could be just the way that our industry is growing, and that it's been very difficult to maintain even an SME of the size that we are over the last few years. Some of our competitors have literally kind of gone under over the last few years.
It's been said before, there's never been a passionate boiler installer. They don't get excited about the boiler, they install the boiler, and that's not detrimental but to the boiler installer. But there is a growing army of very, very passionate heat pump installation companies like Louise. Chris is extremely passionate. I know from before, we've met each other a number of times. And Umar is extremely passionate about the future of heat pumps. I think having a heat pump in your own home and understanding the difference, and then being the installer, it makes such a difference. Sometimes you'll see there was a program this week. Was it the List It, Love It or List It? And the guy was having his heat pump installed, and he'd had a great installer. It was obvious, and that homeowner was his body language was having a heat pump was fantastic. And people become passionate about it. It's having that passion. There is a really unique thing growing in the heat pump industry about wanting to explain how great the product is, how much better it could be if you control it properly, and how to set these temperatures correctly. Unfortunately, on the flip side of that, there will be companies that have got to get off site as quick as they can because their company owners want them on the next job to make more money. It's finding and growing more of this passion in the industry to preserve the lifespan of the equipment and the technology. It's the technology we're all trying to protect. We're so passionate about this technology because we know how good it is.
I'm not a heating expert by any stretch of the imagination, and I only found out very recently that boilers actually can run weather compensation. So, Chris, what actually blows my mind is that Barry Sharp actually touched on this in a very recent podcast episode, saying it just involves a very cheap sensor to actually go outside to be able to get that boiler running on weather comp. So if somebody's watching this, obviously we are talking about trying to get people running on low flow temperature systems, as many as possible. And running those boilers at lower flow temperatures is also far more efficient. So could you just explain to our viewers, if somebody has got a boiler and they're watching this and they don't have weather compensation, what should they potentially try and do to figure out whether they can or can't get their system and their boiler to run on weather comp?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing to do would be to speak to the manufacturer of the boiler. They'll be able to tell you if there's just a plug-in kit to be able to add that weather compensation feature on. If it so happens that they've got an old enough boiler that it means that they can't benefit from weather compensation for whatever reason, there's just that input isn't available into the boiler, it's absolutely still worth turning the boiler down. So we've just talked about weather compensation, which is absolutely, I don't come from a boiler background. I mentioned before I come from an automotive engineering background. My first experience of heating was heat pumps. So this idea of weather compensation and cycling, and this is all I've ever known, and the idea that we don't do this in any other heating industry is, seems a bit crazy to me. But I understand the reasons for it, the psychology around that. But with the weather compensation, like I said, that's all I've known. But with that said, there's still no reason, if you don't have that facility, we can still look at just turn the temperature of the boiler down. So where we're using the thermostat, and apologize, I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent here, but where we're turning where we're using the thermostat just as effectively a high limit stat, just to make sure that we don't, overcook the property. Let's get that temperature down coming out of the boiler, regardless of whether we've got weather compensation or not, just to make sure that we're getting the property up to temperature, but that boiler's running longer, and also hopefully within its condensing envelope as well.
Planning to install an air source heat pump? Then get your copy of Bodge Buster. It's packed with must-ask questions, real homeowner insights, and a practical guide for a smoother installation. Available in print and on Kindle. Link in the description. The one recurring question that we actually get now on the forums is households and families that are actually quite large. So maybe there's 4, 5, 6 people in the actual family. And hot water seems to be a recurring issue to try and get, showers, baths, especially, if the kids are getting ready in the morning. Karl, what advice would you give to people if they are struggling to get a sufficient amount of hot water from their heat pump? What could they potentially be looking at?
This is quite a technical situation. It depends on the size of your cylinder. It depends on the temperature of your cylinder. So the advice out there is if your cylinder's adequately sized, you shouldn't really be going above 48 degrees. It's costing you more to heat your cylinder. But if you've got 5 people in a home and you've got a 200-litre cylinder, that's never going to work. Your cylinder's too small. If your cylinder's the right size, then there shouldn't be a problem. There are people in my family, though, unfortunately, who tend to have showers for about 30 minutes. There is a rule of thumb out there when you're designing systems and how many showers there are in commercial settings that a shower is something like 25 litres of water, for instance. Not in my house. I think it's just difficult, isn't it? That whole somebody not understanding how potentially selfish they're being by being in the shower for that long. But you know what? They like being in the shower. It's their me time. That's what they want to be in there. And then they want to come out and find out why somebody's put the thermostat down to 21 and they put it back up to 30. I don't think you can advise on it or control on it unless you're going to have a very dictatorial family. You're always going to have those problems, unfortunately. Cylinder size is super important. We get by. We're 4 adults in our house. We've got a 200-litre cylinder to 48 degrees. And we all get up at the same time in the morning. We all come back at the same time. And we get by. It's okay. It's okay. And that's probably slightly undersized based on current advice. It probably should be 250 to 300. But 200's okay. But don't spend more than 10 minutes in the shower.
So what you actually said is actually quite interesting, Karl, because we've got a 300-litre tank, but it takes up an incredible amount of space in the actual boiler room. And it's just me and my wife, so that water is more than sufficient throughout the day for us to, have showers in the morning, do the washing up and all the rest of it, and then the water reheats in time for the evening. So what you actually raise is quite interesting, because when we have family that come and stay with us, that water runs out in a hurry. So it's actually quite interesting as a strategy to potentially raise that hot water up when you get guests to maybe 60 degrees. So then you've got 300 liters of really hot water that you can then blend down, and that could potentially run. I mean, is that a viable solution for people?
I think it is, but how many people are genuinely going to understand that it's not an everyday occurrence and then go into the settings of the heat pump? And that's the problem. Once you get into the settings of the heat pump, that can be dangerous. That can be dangerous because other things can change. Is it viable? Yes. Is it practical? Probably not. I think all of us could do it, but the reality is that people like things to be simple. But your cylinder seems to be sized for your house, which it should be. I'm guessing you've got more than 2 bedrooms.
Yeah.
So you could potentially have 5 or 6 people in that home. I think 300 litres, unless you've got a 9-bedroom house, Mars, and you're sprawling estate, I think should be adequate. They're in the shower for too long.
The other thing that we're beginning to see a lot more of, so people are running their properties on heat pumps at, maybe 35 degrees, getting rooms up to 21 degrees centigrade. But in a lot of cases, they have got the elderly folk that are living with them that get cold. They need certain rooms to be warmer. And weather compensation almost doesn't seem to allow for that to happen, because if you're heating your property to, let's say, 21 degrees and you want certain rooms to get up to 23, 24 degrees because you have got elderly people or people that are actually vulnerable, how can we get around doing that? And maybe just explain to the viewers what weather compensation is before you tackle that.
Weather compensation to anyone outside of the industry probably sounds really complicated, but it is nothing more than just looking at the outside temperature and then changing the flow temperature from heating device, obviously in our case a heat pump, to match whatever the outdoor design temperature is. So 15 degrees outside, where we typically start to switch on heating, that might be a 35-degree flow temp, and traditionally, at -2 outside, it might be a 50-degree flow temperature. And then there's just a line between the two. That's as complicated as it is. Some manufacturers have slightly more sophisticated systems, but ultimately that's all where the compensation is. In terms of your question around, if you've got differing, if you've got requirements for different temperatures in different rooms within a property, weather compensation isn't the solution for that. It's correct system design. It's making sure that the radiators and the heat output device into that room is correctly sized. It's not particularly difficult. If you've got a radiator X, say 1000 by 600 radiator with a 50-degree flow temperature, so what we'd call like a 30-degree delta between the the room temperature and the mean water temperature of the radiator. Actually, it's not 50 degrees, but use the figures for the sake of this podcast. That might deliver X amount of kilowatts into the room, which then gives you a 21-degree room temperature. Brilliant, right? Everyone's happy, and that's a sort of -2 outside. Now, if the room next door needs 24 degrees, you've got to take into account the bridging across for the partition wall. But again, for the purpose of this podcast and not getting too technical, it's just a case of putting, if the rooms are exactly the same size, for instance, it's just a case of getting more kilowatts into the room, but you're going to have the same mean water temperature, the same flow temperature going to that part of the circuit, because we don't want to talk about like blending down, because there's no need to. We should be doing that at point of heat source. So it might just be a case that we've got 2000 by 600 radiators instead of one. I'm being ridiculous because you wouldn't do it, wouldn't be that extreme, but that would be the way to increase the room temperature in an adjoining room without increasing the flow temperature or without changing the weather compensation curve. So you've got this fine balance, and any good heating engineer will absolutely be able to explain it, explain the correct operation for it, but also design it. And it's purely a case of going, if I've got X amount of temperature coming out of my heat pump, be it 35 degrees, be it 50 degrees, whatever, that's my constant. I can't do anything about that. That's the constant, right. What's my variable? Well, my variable is the heat output device or the heat emitter, which is going to be my radiators, my underfloor heating, fan coils. What do I need to do with that to be able to increase the room temperature or get to whatever comfortable room temperature that the customer's looking for? And that is usually just increasing it to allow the flow temperature to deliver more kilowatts into the room. I'm oversimplifying massively here, but ultimately, it's nothing more complicated than going, you've got X amount of kilowatts coming from the heat pump itself. You've got X amount of temperature. We just need to design a heat emitter circuit that then matches up to whatever the customer's looking for.
I've said this multiple times on the podcast, Louise. We are a very good example of a poorly installed system, as far as our heat pump's concerned. And I think one of our biggest issues is that we've got so many on-off stats throughout the property. But in a lot of cases, I think that if people are very conditioned to running boiler systems, the stats are also very, easy. Oh, it feels a bit cool in here today. I'm just going to go and start knocking that stat up a little bit, get it up to 23, 24 degrees, which ultimately isn't really going to do an awful lot to the heat pump anyway. So if anybody is watching this and they have got a heat pump and they have got loads of on-off stats, what advice would you give them? Is it a matter of getting their installer back and pulling them all out and trying to create an open loop system for them? What's your advice?
Yeah, so I've literally had this example where I took Richard, my technical other half, round to somebody's house who bought an eco new build property with a heat pump. Who was literally saying, I feel lukewarm about this heat pump. So I send Richard round and he finds that everything's thermostatically controlled, like 7 thermostats, including one in the downstairs loo and underfloor heating, which the guy wasn't familiar with either. You can literally kind of disable them all, but you can leave one thermostat, which is in a really neutral position.
Do you need help understanding your heat pump? Then pick up a copy of From Zero to Heat Pump Hero, an essential guide offering practical advice and basic instructions for new heat pump owners to maximize system efficiency. Available in print and on Kindle, link in the description.
So I've got a question for Chris with his technical explanation of how you adapt for granny coming round, because I would say that's quite tough adapting for granny coming round. You almost have to think about it a day ahead. So normally, if you're like having all your radiator valves all kind of open and so that it all flows round, then you'd almost have to raise your water temperature, and then you'd almost have to turn down all the radiators in the other rooms to allow that room where granny was going to be hotter. So it's quite a lot of work in some ways, wouldn't it, to actually adapt when you're trying to keep it all even, and you're like trying to keep, even if it's not an open plan house, effectively treat it like it's an open plan house, so the heat will just be balanced throughout. So I'd say it's actually quite a tough thing to do. In practical terms, we cheat in our house. We have a wood burner, and that's what we put on when granny comes round. And that's literally what we do.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with a primary and secondary heating source. I think that's good. I think that's excellent.
I've always been a big advocate, whether whether people are happy to hear it or not, of my hybrid system. So I've got a gas boiler that supplements my air source heat pump. Correctly designed a system that the air source heat pump should be delivering 80% of the heating through the year. None of the domestic hot water, interestingly. So I don't know whether that's something we want to add into the hot water debate, but all of my hot water is done by the combi boiler. But just picking up on your point, Louise, around the rebalancing the system, because I think there's two interesting points there. There's a lot of debate at the moment around different thermostats, different control philosophies, but also the whole sort of open zone design and whatnot. I think a lot of it, picking up on something that Karl said before, is absolutely a consumer preference. I want individual control of individual rooms, right? Whether that's right, wrong, indifferent, whatever, that's what I want, and similar to someone who drives a Range Rover, knows it's incredibly inefficient compared to a Toyota Prius, but that's what they want, so let them have it, regardless of the ethical conversation, and the whole climate change debate. But what I would say in regard to one thing that I do fairly regular, which as I'm going to say, is incredibly geeky, and I don't know if this is going to resonate with your audience at all, but I've got I've got about 5 or 6 TAPO, so TAPO, humidity and temperature sensors, like around my house. My house is I think it's over 130 square meters, so that's where I needed an upstairs and a downstairs. So it's about 5 or 6 years old. So I've got a thermostat downstairs, thermostat upstairs. And what I will do is fairly regular, more regular than perhaps I should be admitting to. I will see what's going on in the house to understand, is the temperature permeating the different parts of the house that it should do? And then I will start balancing the system. As Louise quite rightly said, that's completely impractical. Now, could we educate homeowners in a way that says turn up heat source and rebalance system to get the temperature, but you're still going to need to measure those rooms to find out if you've got to the temperature that you're looking for?
It's a very contentious debate subjects, almost kind of get into buffer tank territory, really. So I always think about Martin in Friday Night Dinner. He's always walking around with his top off complaining how hot it is. And that's kind of sums it up, doesn't it? That's what families are like. That's what people are like. We're all different. We all have our own internal thermostat. In my home, we've only got heating downstairs. We're coming to the end of a 2-year building project, so we've got no radiators upstairs, which has been fun for the last 2 winters. We've got thermostats in every room downstairs with underfloor heating of the manifold. It's not open loop, obviously, and it's fantastic. I love it. But we're now having radiators, and they're not going to be individually controlled. And I'll hopefully be able to provide opinions on both. But you're in danger of being passionate and potentially over technical as a installer stroke designer about how it should be, and that will be completely opposite to what the homeowner will ultimately want, and that's difficult. I think Louise's approach is great. The fact that you consult with your client before you do anything is so important. You probably still never get it right 100% of the time. Well, definitely not 100% of the time. But the biggest problem with all of this is us, isn't it? We're all different. We all want different temperatures. We can't all just leave a thermostat on at 20, 21 degrees and all be happy. But yeah, some people are promoting open loop, and now I'm seeing the argument swinging back the other way. Who knows what the answer is?
Karl, you actually said something quite interesting in terms of, at the moment it's open loop systems are kind of the flavor of the month kind of thing. And it seems to be, there's very little consistency with regards to installers, the way they do stuff. And I don't think that's wrong. I think, people are trying to figure out the best way going forward. And I watch the industry from a distance, and it's really interesting to see how the open loop system has taken the fancy of a lot of installers, and it's almost like tech's been brushed to one side. And I personally think that tech should be more involved in the systems, as you said, Chris. You've got your TAPOs, and I think that companies like ADEA that are coming on that can start almost self-balancing systems a little bit. I mean, we would be a prime example of that, where our index circuit really struggles to get to temperature, but there's rooms on this side of the house that are absolutely roasting. So that there is enough heat in the system. It's just the distribution of that heat is really, really poor. So do you think that tech should be playing a far bigger role in heat pumps and trying to make them easier to use?
Yeah, I absolutely do. There's a number of different, self-balancing TRV systems out there that don't necessarily correlate directly with the room temperature. But I think there's absolutely and it'd be really interesting if anyone in the audience, perhaps one of the engineers, sort of could pipe up and say, well, actually, there is this newfangled digital technical TRV that communicates directly with the home and all that good stuff. I mean, one thing that I am looking to experiment with over the next month or so is I'm changing all my TRVs for maybe the Honeywell Evo smart home system. One of the sort of digital TRV systems to see if I can get that finite, control over every room without having an individual room start and then having, the individual that 2-port valve that you need to have to sort of correct the distribution into every room. One of the key differences with a heat pump over a boiler is that it's been developed on such a technical platform to begin with. There's so much that we can do with a heat pump, from its energy consumption and operation, that we can't do with a boiler. And it's always been one of the things that's kept me in the industry for, even though I've just had a shave today and I look 21 again. I've been in the industry for a while. And one of the things that's always, brought me back is this idea that, through the use of battery storage and solar PV, you've got an ability to be able to lessen your energy consumption or lessen the cost of that energy. You can't do that with a gas boiler. Gas is gas is gas. There's nothing that you can do to make that cheaper. But also on the distribution side, there's so much that we can do to integrate tech. But it's just finding that balance. And I think there is, looping back to probably one of the sort of threads throughout this is consumer preference and consumer understanding. And you're going to have people that are just used to, the Drayton turn left to go cold, turn right to go hot, thermostat. That's what they're used to. And if we're going to try and take them on a journey towards, much more energy efficient and much better for the environment heat pump system, we can't then do that alongside the here's your iPad to control your heating, because it'll just blow their mind. You know what I mean? We should be educating them to go 21 degrees is an acceptable temperature. And your version of 21 degrees is probably not the way that we do 21. 21 correctly done is warm building fabric, a constant 21 degrees. It feels comfortable. 21 degrees that people are usually doing, which, I was guilty as many years ago. Walk into my house, heating's off, switch on, up to 21 degrees, air temperature, boosh, got up to temperature straight away. Thermostat goes off. Instantly, all of that heat just disappears, all that energy disappears into the walls. Straight away felt cold. Boiler comes on again. So the 21 degrees is the same temperature, but the way that you feel it and the way that it's distributed within the property is completely different. So I feel like I've been saying this for 15 years. There's a big mindset change that we have to go through. But what's nice is every single heat pump that gets installed and every happy person, as Louise mentioned before, walking into the house and it's hot, every person that we get like that is another advocate, whether they are passionate about the technology or not. And let's be honest, we're not going to have, out of the 60 million people in the UK, we're probably going to get a fraction of those people that are as passionate about the equipment as some of the early adopters and the industry are. But the more people that we get that just say, you know what, I don't understand my heat pump, but it's warm. It's warm. It's not costing me a fortune. That's all I really care about. They go, cool, right, we've done. Right, package that up, on to the next one, on to the next one.
So, Karl, you've had a heat pump for 20 years, and so you guys are kind of well versed into what that heat feels like. Could you explain to people the difference between the heat generated between a boiler and a heat pump, but answer from this perspective, in that we've got a hybrid system like Chris. When the temperatures go cold outside, we've got the whole house set to 21 degrees. The rooms feel warmer at 21 degrees when the boiler's running versus 21 degrees when the heat pump's running. It's a far gentler heat. So if somebody is now, trying to convince their family that the heat pump's the way to go, this is the way that it's going to be heating the house, you're going to go up to the radiator. It's not going to feel hot. It's going to feel barely warm. How do you explain that to them to say, look, don't freak out. This actually is going to heat your home?
Even I struggled with that after years decades of talking to people about, air conditioning and heat pumps. And then we've had 2 radiators in bathrooms, and going in and the room, you're right, the room is warm, but the radiator's cold. And I got it straight away. I just understood why people don't understand it, because that is not emitting 60 to 80 degrees, heat out of that radiator. The benefit for me is, and I've had all 3. I've had, the boiler, I've had an air conditioning heat pump with, indoor air conditioning units, and then a air to water heat pump with underfloor heating and rads. It's just fantastic, isn't it? It's just, there's no cold spots. I don't think it's just down to whether it's a boiler or a heat pump. It's designed properly. It's designed properly, it's applied properly. So it could be a boiler. If you're interested in having a heat pump in your home, understand fabric first. You maintain the heat of the fabric, which is the walls, the ceilings, the floor of your building. You are heating that. When you touch your wall, if it's cold, that's your fabric, it's cold fabric. If you keep your heat pump on and you run it at 19, 20, 21 degrees all day, every day. I actually knock mine back a bit, Louise, slightly different to you. At night time, I do knock it back to 17, but my fabric maintains that heat. Hotels do it. When you check out in a hotel, they will knock that temperature back from what you had it back to 16, for instance, during the day. When you check in, there's a system that as soon as you check in at reception, your air conditioning comes on and they heat that room to 20. So when you walk into your hotel room, it's warm. That's the strategy. So think like a hotel owner and think how you want to be when you walk into your hotel room. You don't want to be cold. They do it, and they manage their bills, and they know that it costs less than to turn it on and off.
We've got this culture of what I call 21st century heating, which is what we're all involved with. And it's that comfort factor and that well-being factor. Whereas there's still a sort of thing of, to be energy efficient, you're got to be like, put on loads of jumpers and turn your thermostat right down and all of this conserving. But that, I don't feel, we should be energy efficient, but comfortable. And you think of an aging population, and older people need to have that comfort factor, because if they get chilled and they're at home, it's really not good for their well-being. What I say to people, and this is from my own lived experience, is when you've had a heat pump system installed and you're going through that getting familiar with how it works, is it might take a bit of tweaking, but when you forget about it, when you're not aware of it, and like I am now in my house, sitting here in my office with my K3 radiator next to me, not even in the underfloor heated part of our house, it's just comfortable. You're not thinking about it. You're not thinking about being hot or cold, because either of those is uncomfortable to some degree, isn't it? But when you're just like, oh, it's just fine, that's when you got it right, isn't it?
One of the things that I had to get over with with my wife was just around the recognition of what a comfortable temperature is. And she's been with me for many years. When I've been in the industry, she knows that often I talk to people about what correct temperature in homes should be, or comfortable temperature should be, albeit people have their own preferences. And one of the things that I did too, and she's going to hate me for telling you guys this and a wider audience, but one of the things I did is I put a temperature sensor just behind where she sits on the couch, so that when she turns around and goes, I'm freezing, I go, cool, let's have a look. It's 21 degrees right next to your head. Like, it's impossible, you're not freezing. And just that psychology change, just that introduction of a number is enough for her to go, okay, mate, yeah, maybe you're right, actually, maybe you're right. And I've done it myself. I'll go, God, I feel cold. And I'll be sat in my office, so I'm in my little home office here. I'll be sat in my office, and I go, I'm going to feel cold. And then I'll look at one of my temp sensors and go, but it's 21 degrees. I'm not cold. There's definitely this idea that, saving the environment and cost efficient and efficient heating in general should be, fairly poor. And it should be, as soon as it gets cold, you've got to put on 3 or 4 jumpers, as well as, a blanket and whatnot. What I would say, and this is something I try and do with my family, is that if it's below 0 degrees outside, you can see, especially if you can see frost, below 4 degrees, I do expect people to be rocking a blanket. Do you know what I mean? Even though, yes, we've got the heating system set up, but whenever you get that sort of quick change in temperature, whether it's like in my kitchen diner where we've got the sun comes across, changes the temperature in that room quite quickly, the sun disappears, everyone feels a bit colder, even though the temperature might be 21 degrees. Let's stick a blanket on. Do you know what I mean? It's inexpensive, and it's winter, and I just tipping up to someone's house many years ago. and tipping up to their door. It's frosty outside. It was snowing outside, and they opened the door. This was a heat pump that wasn't operating. They opened the door in shorts and t-shirt in the middle of winter, and I'm going, heat pump, boiler, whatever. Dude, you've got it completely wrong here. This is not the way that we're supposed to do it.
I live in shorts and a t-shirt throughout
It's-
the year.
If it works for you, Mars, then that's fine. This guy was complaining he couldn't get his heat pump up to 26 degrees, and I'm going, we need to have a chat. We need to have a chat.
You know, Louisa mentioned about her her log burner. We've got a log burner, and we've got a fantastic heat pump, and the weather compensation isn't smart enough to understand that it's 6 degrees during the day and then -8 at night. You can't adapt your system that quickly. So having a log burner is brilliant. The dog jumps up with a blanket. We're all cozy. That's part of what being British is about. But going back to the thermostat one quickly, I remember, I'll never forget this thing I was told. There's a chap in the industry who disconnected his thermostat because he was sick and tired of his wife always putting it up to 32, and he installed a new one underneath the stairs and has set it at 20, and he didn't tell her. He said it saved his marriage because she kept bringing it up to 30, and every now and then he'd just be cheeky and put it back down to 22, but he just never did anything. And when she put it up to 30 and she thought she had the control, she never complained about the heat again.
In a work sense, we have been asked by holiday property owners to set those stats like you're talking about, so the residents can't tamper and turn the heating up to 24 degrees. So it looks like they can, but it's a dummy and they're not actually. So that's the psychology, isn't it? That's what we're talking about.
I think sometimes we're in danger of wanting our client base, the homeowner, to be too smart. That's a peril, because me personally, my brain's fried when I go home. I don't want to be smart. I just want my house to work. But unfortunately, it's my job, and like I say, all of my family work here as well. So unfortunately, it doesn't stop. But there's a lot of people out there, and we all know them. And it's just not disrespectful to anyone at all. But they will never know how their heating system works. They don't want to know. They just want to go home and forget everything and just have a nice warm house. Having all these additional smart accessories and devices are fantastic for us, but are they fantastic for the homeowner? Do they really need to know all that, or do they just want to open the door, take their coat off, sit down, have a cup of tea and not worry about it?
Have you got questions about heat pumps and renewables? Then head over to the forums at Renewable Heating Hub for practical advice from thousands of fellow homeowners and heat pump users. So that brings us to the end of this episode of Homeowners Q&A. A big thank you to our guests, Louise, Chris and Karl, for sharing their expertise and insights on helping families and households understand and adjust to heat pumps. And a special thanks to Logikool for sponsoring today's episode and supporting this important conversation. Thank you all for listening, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. As always, stay warm, stay green, stay tuned. Goodbye.